My name is John Montgomery. For a long while, I was on the um, state and regional committee for the American Solidarity Party, and today I'm stepping in to help host this lecture. The Cascadia Solidarity Party is a chapter of the combined states of Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, with committee members from all three states. We'd welcome you to join um, the party, and if you're interested in further connection, you can email the chapter at committee@cascadiasolidarity.org. So I'm going to hand this over to Jeremy
All
Miller.
right, so tonight we've got George Yancey. He's a professor of sociology with an academic interest in race relations and anti-Christian attitudes in the United States. He has developed a Christian model for race relations that can take us beyond colorblindness and anti-racism. He has also done research on anti-Christian attitudes, cultural progressives, and conservative/progressive Christians. His most recent work is the book Beyond Racial Division. In it, he offers a vision of race relations that brings us unity instead of polarization. So, without further tonight, George will be presenting on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And without further ado, I give you George Yancey.
How's
That's
everyone doing? Hope
good.
you all doing well. Uh,
Yes, excellent.
Let me just sort of set the groundwork for today, since this is a situation we're in on DEI and what's happening and why things are happening the way they are. And I don't think you can understand today without going back to 2020 and George Floyd and Albury and everything like that. And you'll remember at that time, during the summer 2020, we had sort of a lot of protests. There was a wave of what we're going to do about this in this country, and what's been known as anti-racism became all the rage. And it was anti-racism this and anti-racism that, and two most popular books that summer was White Fragility by D'Angelo and How to Be Anti-Racist by Kendi. And there's a lot of other books that they've been up there. Everything was anti-racist. All the companies were saying, "Hey, we're anti-racist." All the trainings were anti-racist. Now, what is anti-racist training? Well, in part depends on whatever the person says it is. There's no one set. This is anti-racism training. But the philosophy of anti-racism is one of uh, a notion that racism is prevalent throughout our whole society. That we must be very intentional in trying to address racism, that we need societal change, and the role of whites is to do what people of color want them to do. And so, whatever the training was, when people talk about anti-racism, this is sort of some of the ideas they're touching on. And that leads to sort of diversity training. And so, what's the literature say on diversity training? In other words, does diversity training, does it create positive changes? Does it reduce prejudice? Does it create institutions that are more amenable to people of color? Well, unfortunately, research does not show that. A meta-analysis indicates that diversity training does not reduce prejudice. That people may have a temporary reduction, but generally speaking, it does not reduce prejudice. Uh, a study that would look at companies that instituted this sort of diversity training when it was mandatory found that it did not have an effect in increasing the representation of people of color in the managers' positions. So there's other research that shows that diversity training can create a backlash, so that whites sometimes feel, they actually become more hostile to people of color. Uh, Diversity training sometimes can lead to results of people feeling that people of color have their positions because of their race, not because of their abilities. So the research out there really, the research out there on diversity training is not very positive. When it does work, it works when you engage in perspective taking and skill development. And unfortunately, a lot of the diversity training doesn't do this. So what happened? So all right, so back to 2020. The companies are trying to do anti-racism and school boards trying to do anti-racism and cities are trying to do anti-racism, and they're doing this sort of training. Well, the research shows this is not working. And so 2021 comes along, and we get a backlash against all this anti-racism. And only it doesn't come in backlash against anti-racism. And you'll probably remember this. There's this huge backlash against CRT, critical race theory. Now, they're related. There's no doubt they're related. They're not identical though. But there's this sort of anger against what many people saw as an affront to what they wanted. Part of the issue is that in our society, there's two different types of people on racial issues. There's, and of course, I'm oversimplifying it. I mean, some people are shades of both. There are those who are more the anti-racist perspective. We got to be very active. We got to do something. There are those who argue more of a colorblindness perspective. The best way to deal with race, according to them, is to ignore race. Treat everyone the same, ignore race, and then we'll be good. Well, those individuals are part of the backlash, the more colorblind people, because they were arguing that coming in and talking about race and from their point of view, blaming white people for everything that's wrong, that is not good. That's not what we want. So they were coming in and they had this backlash. They were very upset. Some of them talked about being upset that their kids were being taught that white was bad. And while I think that I don't think that that's accurate, there was a saying among some anti-racism about ending whiteness. Now, the way they define that, varies from person to person. But you have a saying like that. Of course, some people are going to say, well, why are you teaching my kid to end whiteness? He's white or she's white. What are you saying here? So 2021, there was a lot of protests, especially at school board meetings. In fact, uh, I think his name is Youngkins, now the governor of Virginia. I think he partially won that governorship because of all this protest. Because one of the main places we saw a lot of protests was Virginia, and he ran on, no, we're not going to be doing DEI, we're not going to be doing CRT in our schools, and that I think helped him in a purplish, almost blue state to win the governorship as a Republican. So it is backlash that comes there. And so, this is kind of normal. A lot of times, whenever there's a racial incident and then you get the push for some sort of progressive racial effort, you'll get a backlash later on. Well, here comes the backlash. And so we're sort of at a standstill then for a couple of years. This is the Biden years. And so the government's in the control of the Democrats, at least till 2022. I believe 2022, the Republicans won the House, but not the Senate. So they gained some power back. But you still have Biden as president. So part of what happens in my view is that last year during the election, there are a variety of issues that are at play here. I do believe the most important issue was inflation. But one of the issues, and we think of social issues sometimes as abortion or same-sex marriage, but what became a social issue was DEI. The attention sort of shifted off of CRT towards generalized DEI. And there was a push. I believe his name was Christopher Rufo, talked about how to take CRT and to take DEI and to define it in a negative way in order to gain political power. And so there's a push to say, hey, DEI is bad. DEI is awful. It robs people, robs us of our ability to be colorblind. This is a concept that came more alive, especially as more whites began to take on a sort of a politicized racial identity that DEI was racist against whites, and that if we really want to fight racism, we have to fight against DEI. And some people were saying, that things such as Black Lives Matter was just the KKK in black. Now, I'm just saying what they're saying. I'm not saying I agree with this because I don't, but this is what they were arguing. And so President Trump's election among the other issues, I'm not saying it's the only issue or even the most important issue, but among other issues was was this argument about DEI and what we should do about it. And so when he wins, and what I tell people is when Trump won in 2016, he won a political election. When he won last year, he not just won a political election, he also won a cultural election. He didn't have the culture in 2016. The culture wasn't shifting towards him. If you remember back to 2016, the culture was not shifting towards Trump. Politically, he won, but then a lot of the culture sort of still was very much in opposition to him. With people like Musk and Rogan and other influencers, Charlie Cook, Trump at least partially wins the culture last year. And among that is what we do with DEI. So when Trump comes in, the backlash is now complete. You now have obviously, Trump trying to outlaw DEI in the government, but also pressuring schools to not use DEI. And in fact, what's interesting is that as I talk to school leaders today, talking to people who are very concerned about racial issues and want to do something about it, what they're telling me is that they can't get any traction because everyone's afraid of what the government will do if they put anything that resembles DEI. And that becomes problematic because almost anything, in the mindset of some of the individuals, this colorblind mindset, bringing up racial issues to them is DEI. Bringing up, whether or not we have institutional racism is DEI. So there's been a sort of a chilling effect. One can reasonably argue that in 2020 we went too far one way. That some of the training was not only effective, it was harmful. And there's some examples of some bad trainers who probably did a lot of damage. So that I think that's fair. But the backlash is bringing us too far in an opposite direction, to where people are even afraid of talking about racial issues because they're afraid of being labeled DEI. And it's been much more harder to sort of bring this up in this sort of climate. This is not unusual for what happens in racial issues, that something comes up, and there's a backlash, and then we return back to a normative or even further to the right, if you will, than we were before. So that's where we're at DEI, that we've had this sort of backlash. Now, what is DEI? It's the attempt to try to create an atmosphere that is welcoming to people across the racial spectrums. I mean, in official sense, that is what it is. The way this is done, once again, and I think this is an ongoing issue, thinking about things such as DEI, the way this is done, it really is open to whatever the person says. So if I want to be a DEI trainer, and I had, I'd never taken a course on race and ethnicity, the only thing that stops me from not being a DEI trainer is my lack of charisma. If I have enough charisma, I can come and say, hey, I can convince people to give me money to train their people. I'm a DEI trainer. There's no what you want to call it, certification of what makes a DEI trainer. You could go and get a minor in ethnic studies and take 2 or 3 courses in ethnic studies, and you can say, hey, I have expertise. I'm a DEI trainer. And if you have the charisma, you have the ability to convince people to give you money, lo and behold, you're a DEI trainer. So there is this sort of stated objective of DEI, and then there is how DEI is done, and it's done differently across the spectrum. And so that becomes very problematic. I should also mention that when Trump came into office, his effect didn't just affect government, it affected businesses. And so what began to happen was some of back in 2020, some of the businesses came in and they said, hey, we're now anti-racist. And today, not all, but some businesses say, hey, we don't do DEI here anymore. This is why I say Trump won the culture, that the businesses begin to backtrack from that. So what is necessary? What I'd say is what's necessary is diversity training that works. Because diversity training that does not work, in some ways, is worse than no diversity training at all. If you have no diversity training at all, at least you don't have the backlash. If you have bad diversity training, bad DEI programs, you not only don't do any good, but you actually get people mad at you. And I do believe that some of the anger people feel is they had to send up, and I know I've had people say this, I had to send out a program where I was told I was evil because I'm white. Now, did the person actually say that? Was it their interpretation? I'm not there, so I can't say. But I will say that, if a person leads your program and they think that you said that, even if you haven't, you've probably not communicated very well to them. So what we need is programs that work. More programs that work. I would contend that we have some clues as to what would work. As I said before, we know that programs that work, they would include skill development. They would include learning how to take the perspectives of others, and that'd be across the board. So people of color learn how to take the perspectives of whites and vice versa. These sort of programs tend to work. They include conversational skills. So if we wanted to go to DEI to do the things that we hope they will do, which is create an atmosphere where people of all different races feel comfortable, be at work or school or organizations or political party even, then we need to do DEI the right way. And what I have talked about in the past, the right way to do it is to what I call collaborative conversations, teaching collaborative conversations. And what these are is conversations where people learn how to build on each other's ideas and are goal-oriented. So what happens is people say, let's have a conversation on race. And when it happens, a lot of whites will say, I don't want a conversation on race because I don't want to sit in front of some angry black man who berates me for the next hour and a half. And a conversation means I have to shut up and listen to that black guy. And if that's what the person experienced, then I would agree that you're not having a conversation on race. A true conversation is where everyone has a seat at the table, where we can listen to each other's ideas. We don't have to agree with each other's ideas, but we listen and we understand each other's ideas, and then try to find solutions that meet the needs of everybody. That effort, trying to build towards that, would be a positive way of doing DEI. Now, could there be other positive ways of doing DEI? Of course, there can be. What I'm saying is that we can't just throw people wildly into DEI programs and hope that good things are going to happen. We can't have DEI programs that are unregulated and anybody with charisma that can get someone to pay them money can go and do DEI and then hope for the best. The way to do DEI is to think of principles that we already know work from research, thinking of principles of persuasion, where you build community, where you develop commonalities, you find areas of agreement, and then you work from there. This is the direction that I think our society needs to go. So I'm not advocating for going back to 2020 because I do think that there were externalities there that were problematic. And clearly today is not going to work. And what I would tell my conservative friends is this: look, today you guys got the power. There's no denying that. You got the government, and the government is shutting down DEI programs and putting pressure on people, and that's happening. Or you got the power in 2028, or 2030, or 2032. Eventually, you're not going to have the power, and guess what? The progressives are going to come back, and they're going to put their version of it, and we're going to go back and forth, unless at this point in time, while you have the power, you'd invite them in and have a conversation and find solutions that you can all agree upon. Because if we don't do that, then we're just going to go back and forth, and then whoever has the power is going to decide what's going to happen. So that is kind of where we're at with DEI today. It is going to be under attack, and there's going to be some companies that are going to hold on to it. Some school systems are going to hold on to it. Some of the cities, and they're going to hold on to it. But by and large, it's going to be under attack, and that's the way it's going to be for the next at least 2 years, possibly 4 years. Uh, and then we'll see where we go from there. But I would advocate for wherever we're at is to think about new ways. In other words, I would say the solution is not let's just defeat Trump and the Republicans, and so we can put in what we want. I think the solution is to figure out what can work for everyone and try to implement that rather than trying to just defeat Trump and then put in what we want because all that's going to do is just, uh, put put us, whoever us is, in power for a while until the other group comes and takes power. Uh, and to me, that, there's no stable solution in that regard. So there's some of the research on diversity programs, the history of what we see come to DEI, and where the backlashes come from. Uh, Anyone have questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Just a few days ago, I was reading an article from the League of Women Voters who said that the number one beneficiary of DEI programs was white women.
Women, yeah.
And so when I think of DEI, that's not the population I necessarily first think
Yeah.
of. Um, do you think that's partly because of the unregulated part of DEI, or do you think, I mean, why would that happen, I guess?
Yeah, I've heard that too, and I'll be honest, I've not looked deeply into why that is the case. I can speculate why that would be the case. You think about white women, especially if they've married a middle class or in the upper class, they have the advantage of being a woman, so the DI program will pay attention to them, and they have the advantage of having resources. So you think about, I would think the same thing would probably is true for middle class blacks. They're a smaller population, so they're probably not as successful. But if you're middle class African American, then you have the advantage of being an African American and middle class resources. And so, to me, that would be a main reason why white women could take advantage of DEI programs much more so than, say, people of color, uh, because they're more likely to be in a middle class situation. But I'm speculating on that because I'm not really dug into reasons why. I'm sure someone's done some research on that, but I've heard, yeah, I've heard that too.
Okay, thank you.
I'm not sure how to formulate this question, but I'm going to attempt to. Um, some of the things that I have observed in my workplace, which is I live in the Tri-Cities. The county to the north of me is 70%, which is a majority. And the county to the west of me is 60%, which is a majority, not white. The county I reside in is. Um, so our general manager had to go um, remove a union trainer that was doing a class on DEI and perspective understanding and just cancel the class in the middle because it wasn't going to work for the people they were it wasn't going to work for the audience. And so one, was that the right call? I think so. Um, and two, where, when something like that happens, where do you go from there?
Okay, I can't answer the question of the right call since I don't know that particular situation. I do know there's DI trainers that yes, if I had a company, some DI trainers I've seen I would cancel. So I'm not opposed to canceling a trainer who's bad, but I'm not going to say something when I'm not even know nothing about this person.
Right.
Uh, but since this person's been canceled, uh, my suggestion is to try to find a trainer who can meet the needs. And the principles that I've outlined is something that the manager can consider. Uh, you know, if you may interview a trainer and say, hey, are you going to be teaching skills? Are you going to be teaching people across the rest of the spectrum how to take the perspective of others? That sort of thing. It's uh trying to see who I could recommend. I think there's a woman named Chloe who might have some of those skills. Uh, I can't remember her last name. Uh, I've done some trainings, so if you imagine want to talk to me, I'm open to talking about that, and my training would fit into that if that's what the problem was. So it just depends on what the problem was, and maybe the manager wants someone who's more radical. I don't know. Maybe this person was too soft. I don't know.
Oh no, not this person was way too controversial.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, you do want to be careful of your next trainer because people have already been burnt, so they're going to be more defensive. So you
Yeah.
really want to make sure that next trainer is understands these principles. Yes.
Yep.
Sorry, I got something stuck in my throat.
Yeah, not a problem.
So yeah, I'll see if I try to find someone else, but I would be more careful. You have to be very careful because you keep putting for trainers that are not good fits, and eventually people will turn it off completely. It's gonna be hard for the next trainer to come in because they're gonna have to come in and say, "Hey, I know you have someone. I'm not him or her."
I had a couple questions. First, I was wondering, have you looked into other people's trainings? And then second, how did you develop the trainings that you've provided?
The trainings I developed, I operate off the principles that I talked about and develop on how to teach collab conversations. And so that's been the basis of how I've developed, the sort of trainings that I do. Uh, I've, you know, I'm trying to remember. I think it's Chloe Valdez or something like that. I've heard about her trainings. The problem with me to try looking at other people's trainings is, in order to look at the trainings, I have to actually undergo the trainings, which means I have to pay whatever money they have. And I don't, I'm a professor, so I don't have money to be doing that. Uh, I have seen, I was asked to as from a law firm to evaluate a particular type of training, and they provide the materials to me. So I know it's not a training I would recommend. So I'm not going to say the name of it. So that allowed me to evaluate that particular training. But yeah, I don't, obviously I don't want to spend money to evaluate trainings and then not have, I guess I could do that if I could write a book on it or something like that, but then, they'd probably get mad at me and stuff like that. So yeah, so I've not had the chance to do that.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Um, what have the results been when you've um done your trainings?
Well, our numbers are too low for me to say I have statistical results, but the people's reactions to it have been very positive. Now, has it actually really changed them or altered them? I can't say that because I have to have a sufficient number. I don't know if you know about stats, but I have to have statistical power in order to really say that. So I suspect so, but I can't say that.
Yeah. I guess another aspect of it, I mean, just the whole idea that like um abstract ideas can
Hmm.
change a person's um like a person's desires. Because I mean,
Hmm.
diversity and equity and inclusion, those are things that those are values that have to be deeply held in
Right, yeah.
right? And so just the idea that um just ideas and
Hmm.
abstraction could change a person's orientation or their desires seems, I mean, you're asking for a lot. I mean, it's
You're right, yeah. Yeah, you're trying. So yeah, all right. So you bring in D'Angelo, and she, you pay her $20,000, and she speaks, and she does some exercises. She's there for a day, and then she's gone. Even under the best of circumstances, you know, even if there weren't certain issues, there's only so much change that's going to happen because, and this is why it doesn't do long-term prejudice reduction because you go, and even if the person convince you for a little while, it's kind of like, you go off to Bible camp and you go happy and come back, and then 2 weeks later you're back doing what you were doing before. So so part of what my training would be is to teach people how to have conversations and then to try to create uh, structures where they can continue to have those conversations after I'm gone. Because I don't believe that I don't, I believe I'm such a wonderful speaker and such a great orator, I have such great charisma. I can come in and then I'm there with you for a few hours. I come leave and everyone's happy and whistling while they work and all that sort of stuff. I mean, I don't think anyone can really do that. And probably the least effective form of training is just to have the speaker come in and talk to people and then leave.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's the sort of training we get a lot of.
Yeah.
Of the three, diversity, equity, and inclusion, what do you think is which one of the three do you think it's harder or hardest to train on?
Hmm. Uh, it might be the equity part because in the equity part, you really have to have structural change. I mean, you can have diversity without you can have diversity of people. I mean, your attitudes can change and you get diversity. People as change, they're more welcome. You get diversity, you get inclusion with that too. But equity, the way that it's generally been defined, probably takes some sort of structural change. And that's not going to change with just attitudes. The organization has to change in and of itself. So I would think that diversity training would be less effective when it comes to equity. Although, there is research that shows that if you have trainings that are not mandatory but are voluntary, and you do some other types of efforts, you could change the equity. So it's not impossible, but I think it'd be very, very difficult. I'd be hesitant to go into a situation and say, I think I'm gonna have an impact on your equity, in the short term, I don't think that's going to happen. Maybe in the long term, as things open up, then you would. But I think in the short term, I think that's hard for a diversity trend to change. I think you would probably need an institutional consultant to come in and to change some of the structural elements of your organization in order to do that. So yeah, you probably need something like that.
I have one last question here. Um, so you're known for your collaborative conversation approach. That seems
Mhm.
more like a skill, And do you ever give trainings on that? And or is there any like an institute or a college or anything that would give a training on that? Number two, the second part of the question is, do you think that I see a lot of bad behavior online? Do you think that the collaborative conversation approach would work in an online format?
That second question, hardly, it's probably not going to work very well because the problem with the online format is it's hard to engage the kind of conversation because you have all these people watching the conversation. And then, you feel an obligation to win. And while you do want to get your ideas across and you do want to have a say, the win at all costs that I see so much in social media, which I'm guilty of as well. I think that's problematic. Your first question, yeah, I mean, the way I try to incorporate what I think works is through collaborative conversation. So that my training is about how to do collaborative conversation well. That is what my training basically is. I mean, there's information to know why we got to where we got to, but that's the basis of what the information would be.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question if there's time. This is Paul Beidler. I'm just wondering how like, is there a way that that DEI training is necessary, or do you just assume that it's always necessary? I'm also wondering whether there will be a time when it's not necessary, or do we just assume that it will always be necessary in some kind of structural reality that we live in?
I wouldn't assume that's going to always be necessary because, if we go back and look historically, we could have had DEI training for Italian Americans at one point in time. I think no one would advocate for that today because the Italian Americans have been so assimilated into the dominant culture. Uh, is it always necessary today? I mean, I'd be hesitant to say that. Here's what I would say. If the environment you're in, if it lacks diversity, then you probably want to look at how to change that. If the people there who are the numerical minority, which means if you're in most African American environment, if the whites there feel this way, the people there in the numerical minority feel uncomfortable, then you probably want to look into dealing with that. Find out ways in which we can make them feel comfortable. If your environment uh, is diverse in a contextual way, for example, if you're an engineering company, you're not looking at the whole city to see how diverse you are. You're looking at the pool of people who are qualified to be engineers. If it's diverse, contextually, and if the people there who are not in the majority, if they feel comfortable, then I would say no, you don't need DEI program training. You know, and then it may be there's maybe you're not quite as diverse or quite as comfortable, so maybe you don't maybe you need more tune-ups and maybe a lighter touch. If you're in a situation where there's a lot of racial animosity and alienation and not much diversity, then you may need more of an intentional DEI approach. So yeah, I don't think there's a one size fit all to that sort of question.
Thank you.
I think going back to something I was talking about earlier, just the depth of change that needs to occur for
Mhm.
that we're striving for through these sorts of training is almost religious in a sense. Like you're trying to change a person's affections or directions. And um do you think, yeah, I'm just coming back again to the idea, is that sort of thing possible in a business? That I mean, a business has its own telos, it has its own purpose. Do you need this sort of training to be occurring else in a different sort of institution?
Yeah, I think the way to think about it is if at the end of the training people have better chance to communicate with each other and the business works in a framework where they engage in that sort of communication to engage in problem solving, what I think happens over time is they'll get to know each other better. And in that process of knowing and understanding each other, that's where you could have more of this intrinsic change. But you're completely correct. The idea that you're going to come in and train and people are going to be, deeply changed is, I'm not saying it never happens, but it's going to rarely happen. But I think for it to happen systematically, it has to be something where training gets you started, and then it's up to the business to keep it going. So maybe, they have Wednesday lunches where people get in groups and they discuss. And remember, these people have been trained on how to have these discussions. So it's not like get together and argue, but how to have these discussions on issues that's happening around the company or something like that. Because in that process, then they'll get to know other people better. And that's the process I think your really deep change is going to happen. So that's how I would envision that occurring.
Hmm.
Uh, I don't have a model of that occurring yet because once again, I don't have the numbers, and plus I have not worked the business long enough to see whether or not this has happened over time. But there's no reason why this would not happen. We see it happen in other ways. Like people go to counseling. What happens? You develop a relationship with someone, and they help see you through things. Now I know that person's trained, so it's not quite the same thing. But that's that we know that this sort of model, this sort of collab conversation does work in other situations. And so the question is, how can we make it work here? I'll give you a great example of this. Have you heard of Daryl Davis?
Yeah, I haven't.
Okay. I don't, he may not call it collab conversations. I've heard what he says he does. He goes and he listens. And those of you who don't know, Daryl Davis has taught 200 Klansmen, Nazis, what have you, out of the Klan or Nazis, and he's collected their robes. He's an African American musician. Uh, so you know, he may not call clap conversations. Basically, he goes and he talks and he listens to them. He humanizes them, and they learn to like him. And through that process, 200 times, these people have said, "I give up on the Klan. I give up on the Nazis," which I think we agree is a deep, intrinsic change.
Mm.
But that takes time, and that takes effort, and most of us, and myself included, are not inclined to invest that much time into people such as the Klan or Nazism. Maybe we should do that more, but we don't. But he does, and this is some of his results. And so we know it can work. It's just a matter of figuring out how to make it work.
John, I'll give you a little another example. I'm going to go pick on my own church denomination here for a second. The Orthodox Presbyterian Church has made no attempt and has no desire to change its relatively uniform culture and practices. But its kissing cousin, the Presbyterian Church of America, in places in this country, seems to be making a concerted effort to do so. And the difference between the two denominations, the experience of the worship services, um, you can feel it. It's night and day.
Mm. That's great. Thank you for that, Chris. Do you have any other questions?
Just one final comment, I guess. I think George is definitely on to something. It's something that I've tried to practice in the way that I approach. I am an IT tech worker, and I have spent my entire career working with sewer workers and water personnel and linemen, and they're not like me at all. And I'm trying to get them to work with these stupid things called computers and iPads. And, you have to sit in their shoes. You have to understand their work practice. You have to understand their culture. And a lot of that just comes down to just sitting down with them in the break room, having lunch with them, understanding where they're coming from, so that when you're trying to make a decision that's going to affect them, you feel, if I change X, it's going to make them feel Y. And I just find that very effective in empathetically sharing the burden that they have, and not just unilaterally bringing top-down change on onto them. And I think that's an effective approach. And so, but it takes time. And sometimes my supervisor asks why I spend so much time over there in the shops. Well, do do you want this change to be effective or not? So that's kind of my little window into um, DEI and how I try to practice it in the workplace.
That's good. George, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I think that is a version of a collaborative conversation as far as going and being there with them. I mean, it's probably using some of the principles that are there without it being as organized. I think something that we can do organically, although, but it's also good to have some training and to have some knowledge as to how we can engage in it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much, George. If no one else has any questions, appreciate you volunteering tonight and being here with us and letting us know about DEI.
All right. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you, George.
Thank you.
Thank
You
you.
too.
Good night.
Good night.